The cameras captured it all, one single moment when the world held its breath, and watched as everything they thought they knew about the British royal family crumbled before their eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The transition was meant to be gradual, ceremonial, predictable. But on that crisp October morning in 2024, as Prince William and Catherine stepped onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, wearing crowns that had never been intended for them, the silence that followed their appearance spoke louder than any royal proclamation ever could. What the world witnessed wasn't just a change of monarchy. It was the moment when two people, thrust into the most scrutinized roles on earth under circumstances no one could have predicted, chose to break every rule their predecessors had written. The silence wasn't from shock at their new titles. It was from the raw, unfiltered humanity they displayed in that first moment as king and queen, and the revolutionary words that followed. The program. This is the true story of how everything changed, how a couple who never expected to rule so soon transformed not just the monarchy but the very concept of what it means to lead a nation in the modern world. Some called it the greatest constitutional crisis in British history. Others called it the most honest moment the royal family had ever shared with their people. The morning sun painted the corridors of Windsor Castle in shades of gold that seemed almost artificial. Catherine walked slowly through halls she had traversed countless times before, but everything felt different now. The weight of the crown jewels, locked away in the Tower of London just hours earlier, seemed to press against her thoughts even though she had never actually worn them. Behind her, the soft footsteps of her security detail echoed like whispers of the storm that was about to break over the United Kingdom. 3 days earlier, the world had been normal as life could be for the Prince and Princess of Wales. William had been reviewing agricultural sustainability reports in his study while Catherine worked on her early childhood development initiatives. Their children were at school complaining about mathematics homework and debating whether strawberry or chocolate ice cream was superior. It was domestic, peaceful, and utterly unremarkable for a family that happened to be third and fourth in line to the British throne. The call came at 11:37 in the evening on Tuesday. Catherine remembered the exact time because she had been checking her phone before setting it on the nightstand when William's private line rang. Not his official royal phone, not his public engagement mobile, but the secure line reserved for family emergencies and matters of state that could not wait for morning. They both knew that calls on that line at such an hour meant only one thing, and neither of them wanted to answer it. William's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the receiver. Catherine watched his face transform from sleepy confusion to sharp attention, then to something she had never seen before, complete and utter disbelief. He said very little during the conversation, mostly single words of acknowledgement and one repeated phrase that would haunt them both for days afterward. "Are you absolutely certain?" King Charles had collapsed during a private dinner at Sandringham. Not the kind of collapse that could be managed with discreet medical attention and careful press releases. The kind that required immediate emergency surgery and left the finest doctors in the United Kingdom using phrases like uncertain prognosis and critical condition. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 20 minutes later when the second call arrived. This one about Queen Camilla, who had suffered what appeared to be a massive stroke while being briefed about her husband's condition. Catherine had studied constitutional law as part of her preparation for royal life, but no textbook could have prepared her for the reality of what happened next. When both the monarch and their spouse are incapacitated simultaneously, the line of succession moves with mechanical precision regardless of anyone's readiness or desire. William, as the heir apparent, would need to assume the duties of the crown immediately. Catherine, as his wife, would become queen consort whether she felt prepared or not. The palace machinery moved with ruthless efficiency. Private secretaries appeared at Windsor Castle before dawn, carrying sealed briefings and constitutional documents that William would need to understand before the sun rose. Catherine found herself surrounded by protocol officers explaining procedures she had hoped to learn gradually over many years, not digest in a matter of hours. The children would need to be informed, but carefully, and their security details would require immediate adjustment. Every aspect of their lives was being reorganized by people who seemed to have rehearsed for this exact scenario. What the officials and constitutional experts had not rehearsed for was William's response to the briefings about continuity and constitutional duty. He asked questions that made the seasoned palace staff exchange uncomfortable glances. Questions about transparency, about the monarchy's role in modern governance, about whether the institution needed to change fundamentally rather than simply transfer from one generation to the next. Catherine watched her husband transform before her eyes during those first briefings. The William she had married was thoughtful and principled, but he had always been content to follow established protocols and honor traditional approaches to royal duty. This new William, faced with the reality of immediate kingship, seemed to be questioning everything their predecessors had taken for granted, wanted to know why royal finances weren't fully transparent to Parliament. He questioned whether the monarchy needed to maintain its current level of ceremony and distance from ordinary citizens. Most disturbingly for the palace staff, he wondered aloud whether the crown should have any political influence at all, even the ceremonial kind that had been carefully preserved for centuries. The constitutional implications of William's questions were staggering. The British monarchy had survived and thrived by adapting gradually, never making sudden changes that might destabilize the delicate balance between tradition and modernity. But William wasn't talking about gradual adaptation. He was talking about revolutionary transparency and dramatic shifts in how the crown related to British society. The officials tried to explain that such changes would require careful consideration over many years, possibly decades. William's response was simple and terrifying in its implications. They might not have decades. If the monarchy was going to survive in the 21st century, it needed to prove its relevance immediately, not eventually. Catherine found herself caught between supporting her husband's vision and understanding the institutional panic his ideas were causing. The palace staff had spent their entire careers managing the careful evolution of royal tradition. They knew how to handle constitutional crises, medical emergencies, and public relations disasters. They had no framework for managing a new monarch who wanted to fundamentally reimagine the crown's role in British society before his coronation ceremony had even been planned. The media, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the constitutional revolution being debated in the private chambers of Windsor Castle. The official statements about King Charles and Queen Camilla's conditions were carefully worded to suggest serious but manageable health concerns. No mention was made of the Prince of Wales's assumption of royal duties or the profound questions being raised about the monarchy's future. The press focused on medical bulletins and speculation about recovery timelines, completely missing the fact that William and Catherine were quietly preparing to challenge centuries of royal tradition. By Thursday evening, Catherine realized that her husband was not going to be content with the traditional assumption of royal duties. The briefing papers lay scattered across his desk, many of them annotated with questions and comments that would have horrified previous monarchs. William had spent 2 days learning about the constitutional powers he was inheriting, and instead of being reassured by the tradition and precedent behind those powers, he seemed disturbed by how much of royal authority existed without meaningful oversight or accountability. The turning point came during a late-night conversation in their private sitting room. Catherine found William standing at the window, looking out at the grounds of Windsor Castle in the darkness. When she asked what he was thinking about, his answer changed everything. "I keep wondering what gives us the right to all of this. Not just the castles and the titles, but the assumption that we somehow deserve to represent the British people without ever being chosen by them." Catherine had wrestled with similar thoughts throughout her years as a royal, but she had always accepted that questioning the fundamental legitimacy of monarchy was both pointless and potentially dangerous. The institution existed, it provided stability and continuity, and their role was to serve it with dignity and competence. But William's question went deeper than institutional loyalty. He was questioning whether constitutional monarchy itself could be justified in an age of democratic accountability and transparent governance. The implications of his doubts extended far beyond their family. If William genuinely believed that the monarchy needed to justify its existence rather than simply continuing by historical precedent, then his reign would be unlike anything in British constitutional history. Previous monarchs had adapted the crown to changing times while preserving its essential character. William seemed prepared to transform the crown so fundamentally that it might not be recognizable as the same institution his father and grandmother had served. Friday morning brought news that King Charles remained unconscious, and Queen Camilla's condition had not improved. The palace staff informed William that he would need to make his first public appearance as acting monarch within 24 hours. The British people and the world were beginning to ask questions about the succession and the continuity of royal duties. The carefully managed medical bulletins could only maintain public confidence for so long before more substantial reassurances became necessary. Catherine knew that her husband's first public appearance would set the tone for everything that followed. If he delivered traditional statements about duty, service, and constitutional continuity, the monarchy would continue its gradual evolution under his eventual rule. But if he chose to voice the revolutionary questions he had been exploring in private, the consequences would be impossible to predict or control. The British constitutional system, indeed the very concept of constitutional monarchy, might never be the same. As they prepared for what would become the most significant royal appearance in modern British history, neither William nor Catherine fully understood that they were about to trigger a global conversation about the relevance of monarchy in the democratic age. All they knew was that the comfortable certainties of their previous life had disappeared forever, and the decisions they made in the next few hours would echo through British history for generations to come. The silence that would greet their first appearance as king and queen was still 24 hours away, but the ideas that would create that silence were already reshaping their understanding of what it meant to wear the crown in the modern world. The morning of William and Catherine's first public appearance as acting monarchs began with an argument that would have scandalized previous generations of royal courtiers. The disagreement wasn't about protocol or constitutional procedure, subjects that had dominated palace conversations for decades. Instead, William and Catherine found themselves debating whether they should tell the British people the complete truth about their intentions for the monarchy, or whether such honesty would cause more harm than good. Catherine stood in their private dressing room at Windsor Castle, watching her husband pace between windows that framed a view of grounds that had witnessed 8 centuries of royal history. The weight of that history seemed to press against the walls around them, but William appeared determined to break free from its constraints, rather than draw strength from its continuity. He had spent the night reading constitutional documents and historical precedents, not to understand how previous monarchs had handled similar situations, but to identify which traditions he believed needed to be abandoned entirely. The palace staff had prepared talking points for William's address that emphasized stability, continuity, and the Crown's commitment to serving the British people with the same dedication shown by his predecessors. The draft speech referenced Queen Elizabeth II's lifetime of service, King Charles's devotion to charitable causes, and the monarchy's role in maintaining Britain's constitutional balance. It was dignified, reassuring, and completely unacceptable to William in his current frame of mind. Catherine understood her husband's frustrations with traditional royal rhetoric, but she also recognized the dangers of abandoning established approaches too quickly. The monarchy had survived wars, constitutional crises, and social upheavals by adapting gradually and maintaining public confidence through periods of uncertainty. William's desire for immediate transparency and fundamental reform, while admirable in principle, could destabilize the very institution he was preparing to lead. The compromise they reached that morning would later be analyzed by constitutional scholars as either brilliant political innovation or catastrophic miscalculation, depending on their perspective on the monarchy's proper role in democratic society. William would deliver the prepared remarks about continuity and service, but he would also add unscripted comments about his vision for a more transparent and accountable crown. Catherine would stand beside him, not as the traditional silent royal consort, but as a full partner prepared to answer questions about their plans for reforming royal institutions. The decision to take unscripted questions from journalists represented a complete break with royal tradition. Previous monarchs had occasionally given interviews or made impromptu remarks, but always within carefully controlled circumstances with predetermined topics and approved questions. William and Catherine were proposing to expose themselves to whatever inquiries the press corps might pose about their intentions, their qualifications, and their vision for the monarchy's future. The palace communications staff responded to this proposal with barely concealed horror. Royal media management had evolved into a sophisticated system designed to maintain dignified distance between the crown and political controversy. Unscripted interactions with journalists created unlimited opportunities for misstatement, misinterpretation, and constitutional complications that could damage the monarchy's reputation for decades. The possibility that William might repeat his private questions about democratic legitimacy in a public forum was too terrible for the communications team to contemplate seriously. Catherine found herself serving as mediator between her husband's revolutionary impulses and the institutional panic those impulses were creating among palace staff. She shared William's belief that the monarchy needed to demonstrate greater relevance and accountability, but she also understood the practical difficulties of implementing such changes without careful preparation and broad consultation. The compromise she proposed satisfied no one completely, but offered a path forward that might avoid immediate constitutional crisis. The final arrangement called for William to deliver prepared remarks about the Crown's commitment to serving Britain during the current medical emergency, followed by a brief statement about his personal vision for making royal institutions more accessible and transparent. Catherine would then join him to answer a limited number of questions from accredited royal correspondents about their immediate plans and long-term goals. The session would be broadcast live, ensuring that their words reached the British public without editorial interpretation or selective quotation. The hours leading up to the scheduled appearance were filled with frantic preparation that differed dramatically from traditional royal event planning. Instead of rehearsing ceremonial procedures and reviewing guest lists, William and Catherine found themselves anticipating hostile questions about constitutional authority, democratic legitimacy, and the economic justification for royal expenditures. The palace staff tried to prepare them for potential inquiries about specific aspects of royal finances, constitutional powers, and institutional reform, but William insisted that honest answers would serve the monarchy better than carefully crafted evasions. The transformation in Catherine's role became apparent during these preparation sessions. Previous royal consorts had been trained to provide graceful support for their spouses' public duties while avoiding substantive policy discussions or controversial topics. Catherine was preparing to discuss complex constitutional questions, defend specific reform proposals, and articulate her own vision for the monarchy's evolution. The palace staff struggled to develop appropriate protocols for a queen consort who intended to function as a full partner in royal decision-making rather than a decorative supporter of her husband's authority. The international implications of William and Catherine's planned approach began to emerge as foreign governments and Commonwealth realms received advance briefings about the session. The British monarchy served as head of state for numerous countries that had maintained constitutional ties to the crown through centuries of political evolution. If William's reform agenda proved too radical for British public acceptance, it could trigger constitutional crises throughout the Commonwealth and potentially threaten the political stability of nations that had never seriously considered republican alternatives to constitutional monarchy. The morning of the appearance brought unexpected news that further complicated an already volatile situation. King Charles had regained consciousness during the night, but his medical team reported significant cognitive impairment that might prevent him from resuming royal duties for months or possibly years. Queen Camilla's condition remained critical, with doctors unable to predict when or whether she might recover sufficiently to return to public life. The medical developments meant that William and Catherine's assumption of royal duties might be more permanent than anyone had initially anticipated. The constitutional implications of long-term incapacity rather than temporary illness created new urgency around William's reform agenda. If he and Catherine were going to serve as de facto monarchs for an extended period, their vision for the crown's role would have immediate practical consequences rather than remaining theoretical discussions for future consideration. The British government, Parliament, and the international community would need to understand and adapt to fundamental changes in how the monarchy operated, not in some distant future, but potentially beginning immediately. Catherine spent the final hour before their public appearance reviewing briefing materials about constitutional law, royal finances, and historical precedents for monarchical reform. She had originally planned to limit her comments to social issues and charitable initiatives, subjects that fell within traditional boundaries for royal consorts. But William's determination to address fundamental questions about the crown's legitimacy and democratic accountability meant that she might need to discuss any aspect of royal authority or institutional structure. The realization that their marriage would now function as a true political partnership rather than a traditional royal relationship represented perhaps the most personal dimension of the changes they were contemplating. Previous royal couples had maintained distinct roles that reinforced constitutional traditions about monarchical authority and consort support. William and Catherine were preparing to present themselves as joint decision-makers, committed to shared leadership of royal institutions and collaborative development of crown policy. The technical preparations for their appearance reflected the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting. Royal events traditionally featured carefully choreographed ceremonies with predetermined outcomes and minimal opportunities for spontaneous interaction. The broadcasting arrangements for William and Catherine's session resembled a political press conference more than a royal engagement, with multiple camera angles, live fact-checking capabilities, and provisions for extended questioning periods if circumstances warranted. The final briefing session with palace communications staff revealed the full scope of institutional anxiety about William and Catherine's plans. The senior courtiers, who had spent decades managing royal public relations, expressed serious concerns about the precedents being established and the potential for irreversible damage to the monarchy's constitutional position. Their warnings were respectful but stark. Constitutional monarchy depended on maintaining dignified distance from political controversy, and direct engagement with contentious questions about democratic legitimacy could undermine centuries of carefully preserved royal authority. Catherine understood these concerns intellectually, but she also recognized that her husband's questions about the monarchy's relevance reflected broader public skepticism about hereditary institutions and democratic societies. If the crown could not provide compelling justifications for its continued existence, traditional approaches to maintaining royal dignity might simply postpone rather than prevent constitutional crisis. The choice was not between preserving the status quo and risking radical change, but between attempting controlled reform and allowing uncontrolled decline. As they prepared to leave their private quarters for the journey to Buckingham Palace, William and Catherine both understood that their relationship with the British people was about to change irrevocably. They could no longer assume public deference to royal tradition or constitutional precedent. Everything they had taken for granted about their roles and responsibilities would now be subject to democratic scrutiny and public debate in ways that previous generations of royals had never experienced. The car journey to central London took place in contemplative silence, broken only by occasional comments from their security detail about crowd control arrangements and media coordination logistics. Neither William nor Catherine attempted to rehearse their remarks or anticipate specific questions they might face. They had made their fundamental decisions about honesty and transparency. The rest would depend on their ability to articulate their vision clearly and their willingness to accept whatever consequences emerged from their unprecedented departure from royal tradition. The famous balcony of Buckingham Palace had hosted countless royal appearances throughout British history, but nothing in its centuries of service had prepared it for what transpired on that crisp October morning. As William and Catherine emerged from the palace's interior, the assembled crowd below fell into a silence so complete that individual camera shutters could be heard clicking from hundreds of feet away. It wasn't the respectful quiet that typically greeted royal appearances filled with anticipation and ceremonial dignity. This was something far more profound, the silence of a nation holding its breath while witnessing the complete transformation of an institution they had thought they understood. The visual impact of their appearance struck observers before either of them spoke a single word. William wore a simple dark suit instead of military regalia or ceremonial robes, while Catherine had chosen an elegant but understated navy dress that could have been appropriate for any serious professional occasion. The palace wore no crowns or ceremonial insignia and presented themselves to the British people as two individuals rather than embodiments of constitutional tradition and hereditary privilege. The crowd that had gathered in the early morning hours expected to see the familiar pageantry of royal ceremony, even during a constitutional emergency. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented in modern British history. Two people preparing to claim the highest positions in the land while deliberately rejecting the visual symbols that had traditionally validated such claims. The absence of royal regalia was not an oversight or emergency accommodation, but a conscious choice that communicated more about their intentions than any prepared speech could have conveyed. William stepped forward to the balcony's edge, and when he began to speak, his voice carried across the crowd without the amplification typically used for royal addresses. This was another departure from tradition that seemed minor but carried enormous symbolic weight. Previous monarchs had literally spoken from above their subjects, using both physical elevation and technical amplification to maintain the distance that constitutional theory required between the crown and the people. William was choosing to address the nation as one person speaking directly to others, without barriers or intermediation. His opening words shattered centuries of royal precedent with their simplicity and directness. Instead of the traditional formula invoking divine authority and constitutional duty, William began with a personal acknowledgement that surprised even Catherine. "I stand before you this morning as someone who never expected to be in this position, speaking words I never imagined I would need to say. My father and stepmother remain seriously ill, and Catherine and I have been asked to assume responsibilities that we hope to prepare for over many years, not days. The crowd's reaction to this unprecedented personal opening was visible even from the balcony. Royal audiences had been trained for generations to maintain respectful attention during ceremonial addresses, but William's conversational tone and vulnerable admission created a different dynamic entirely. People began moving closer to the palace gates, leaning forward as though they were participating in an intimate conversation rather than witnessing a formal state occasion. Catherine watched her husband establish this new relationship with the British people and realized that there could be no retreat from the path they had chosen. Traditional royal rhetoric would have sounded absurd after William's personal opening, and any attempt to return to ceremonial distance would have appeared artificial and manipulative. Their commitment to transparency and directness would now need to extend through every aspect of their public service, creating precedents that would influence the monarchy for decades to come. William's prepared remarks about continuity and service, carefully crafted by palace speechwriters to provide constitutional reassurance, have been completely discarded in favor of an impromptu discussion about the uncertainty they all faced together. He acknowledged that he and Catherine were learning about their new responsibilities while simultaneously attempting to fulfill them, and he admitted that they had more questions than answers about how the monarchy should serve Britain in the modern world. The constitutional implications of these admissions were staggering for anyone familiar with royal tradition and legal theory. The Crown's authority had always been presented as certain, established, and continuous regardless of the personal qualities or preparation of individual monarchs. William was acknowledging publicly that his authority was uncertain, his preparation inadequate, and his understanding of royal responsibility evolving in real time. Such admissions could undermine the constitutional foundations that had supported British political stability for centuries. Catherine stepped forward to join her husband at the balcony's edge, and her presence transformed the occasion from a royal address into something resembling a partnership presentation to the nation. When she began to speak, her words complemented William's personal approach while introducing ideas that would have horrified previous generations of constitutional theorists. We believe that the British people deserve to understand how decisions are made in their name and how resources are used for their benefit. We want to earn the respect and trust that previous generations of our family have enjoyed, rather than simply inheriting it along with our titles. The concept of a monarchy that needed to earn public support rather than command it by constitutional right represented a fundamental challenge to hereditary government itself. Catherine was essentially arguing that democratic principles should apply to royal institutions, that public accountability should extend to Crown activities, and that the British people should have meaningful input into how their constitutional monarchy operated. Such ideas had been explored in academic discussions about constitutional reform, but never voiced by someone preparing to assume the throne. The crowd's response to Catherine's remarks revealed the depth of public sentiment that traditional royal protocols had never allowed to surface. Instead of the polite applause that typically greeted royal statements, people began calling out questions and comments that reflected years of suppressed curiosity about royal finances, decision-making processes, and the justification for hereditary privilege in a democratic society. The spontaneous dialogue that developed between the balcony and the crowd created precisely the kind of uncontrolled interaction that palace staff had spent decades preventing. William and Catherine exchanged glances before making the decision that would define their approach to royal service for years to come. Instead of concluding their remarks and withdrawing to the safety of palace privacy, they chose to engage directly with the questions and comments emerging from the crowd. This improvised question-and-answer session violated every principle of royal media management and constitutional protocol, but it also created an authentically democratic interaction between the Crown and the people that Britain had never previously experienced. The questions that reached the balcony reflected the sophisticated understanding of constitutional issues that British citizens had developed despite being excluded from meaningful participation in royal governance. People asked about the cost of royal security, the transparency of Crown finances, the process for making decisions about state visits and diplomatic representation, and the monarchy's role in political and social controversies that affected ordinary citizens' lives. Catherine found herself discussing specific aspects of royal expenditure and decision-making that had been treated as state secrets for generations. She explained how security assessments influenced royal travel decisions, described the process for reviewing charitable patronages and public engagements, and acknowledged that many royal traditions existed for historical rather than practical reasons. Her willingness to provide detailed answers to complex questions demonstrated that she and William had prepared for genuine accountability rather than symbolic transparency. The international media, initially focused on the medical emergency that had prompted the occasion, rapidly shifted attention to the constitutional revolution being broadcast live from Buckingham Palace. Foreign correspondents recognized that they were witnessing either the modernization of monarchy for the 21st century or its voluntary dissolution through democratic accountability. The implications extended far beyond Britain to every constitutional monarchy and every nation that maintained the crown as head of state. The session continued for over an hour, far longer than any royal public appearance in modern history. William and Catherine answered questions about everything from the role of royal prerogatives in contemporary governance to their personal views on social justice, economic inequality, and climate change. They acknowledged disagreements between themselves on some issues while emphasizing their shared commitment to transparent decision-making and public accountability. The most dramatic moment came when a voice from the crowd asked directly whether they believed hereditary monarchy could be justified in a democratic age. William's response would be quoted and analyzed for years afterward. "We believe that institutions, including royal ones, must prove their value through service rather than claim authority through tradition. If the British people decide that constitutional monarchy no longer serves their interests, we would respect that decision and work to ensure a smooth transition to whatever system they preferred." Catherine's immediate support for this revolutionary statement eliminated any possibility that it could be dismissed as a personal opinion rather than royal policy. She added that they hoped to demonstrate the monarchy's value through increased transparency and accountability, but acknowledged that such demonstration might reveal problems that could not be solved within existing constitutional frameworks. Their willingness to contemplate the possibility of constitutional monarchy's peaceful conclusion stunned observers who had assumed that royal preservation was the crown's primary objective. The crowd's reaction to these exchanges evolved throughout the session, from surprised attention to engaged participation, and finally to something approaching enthusiasm for the new relationship William and Catherine were establishing with the British people. The traditional barrier between the crown and democratic participation had not merely been lowered. It had been deliberately dismantled by two people who seemed determined to serve as constitutional monarchs only if they could do so with genuine public consent. As the impromptu session finally concluded, William and Catherine did not withdraw immediately to palace privacy as royal tradition required. Instead, they remained on the balcony, acknowledging individual questions they had not been able to address and promising continued dialogue about the monarchy's role and responsibilities. Their final gesture was to wave not as distant figures graciously acknowledging subjects, but as neighbors saying goodbye after an extended conversation with friends. The silence that greeted their eventual withdrawal was different from the silence that had welcomed their appearance. The crowd remained below the balcony for nearly an hour after William and Catherine disappeared into the palace, as though processing the implications of what they had witnessed. The traditional relationship between the crown and the British people had been transformed so fundamentally that no one seemed quite sure what protocols should govern their departure. The immediate aftermath of William and Catherine's unprecedented balcony appearance sent shockwaves through institutions that had operated according to established protocols for centuries. Within hours, the palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from constitutional scholars, foreign governments, Commonwealth officials, and British parliamentarians seeking clarification about the implications of what they had witnessed. No one seemed quite sure whether they had observed the modernization of monarchy or its voluntary abdication of traditional authority. The British government found itself in the unprecedented position of needing to respond to questions about constitutional changes that had been announced by the Crown without prior consultation with elected officials. The Prime Minister's office, traditionally kept informed about major royal initiatives well in advance, had received no warning about William and Catherine's departure from established protocols. The civil servants who specialized in constitutional law discovered that their expertise provided little guidance for managing a situation where the monarchy had voluntarily subjected itself to democratic accountability. Parliament faced equally novel challenges, as members from all parties demanded emergency sessions to discuss the constitutional implications of the morning's events. The traditional relationship between the crown and parliamentary authority had been based on careful separation of royal ceremonial functions from democratic political processes. Into transparency and accountability appeared to merge these previously distinct spheres in ways that existing constitutional frameworks could not easily accommodate. International reaction revealed the global significance of what had transpired at Buckingham Palace. Foreign heads of state, many of whom maintained diplomatic relationships with Britain specifically because of the monarchy's stabilizing influence on constitutional governance, needed to understand whether the Crown's new approach represented enhanced legitimacy or dangerous instability. Countries that shared the British monarch as head of state faced the immediate question of whether their own constitutional arrangements remained viable if the Crown had fundamentally altered its understanding of royal authority. That Catherine spent the afternoon following their balcony appearance in continuous consultation with constitutional experts who had been hastily summoned to provide guidance about the legal and practical implications of their public commitments. The promises they had made about financial transparency, public accountability, and democratic participation created obligations that existing royal institutions were not equipped to fulfill. Every aspect of Crown operations would need to be reviewed and potentially restructured to deliver the openness they had pledged. The most immediate challenge involved royal finances, an area that had been protected by centuries of careful legal arrangements designed to maintain Crown independence from political interference. Catherine's commitment to public transparency about royal expenditures would require either parliamentary approval for disclosure of previously confidential information or voluntary royal submission to oversight that no previous monarch had accepted. Either approach would establish precedents that could fundamentally alter the balance between royal independence and democratic accountability. William found himself reviewing legal documents that outlined the full scope of royal prerogatives and constitutional powers that he had effectively offered to subject to public scrutiny and potential democratic oversight. The Crown's traditional authorities included everything from diplomatic representation and military command to judicial appointments and parliamentary procedures. His promise of transparency could affect national security considerations, judicial independence, and the separation of powers that had evolved over centuries of constitutional development. The palace communication staff, trained for generations to manage royal privacy and maintain dignified distance from political controversy, struggled to develop new protocols for the unprecedented level of public engagement William and Catherine had initiated. Traditional royal media management relied on controlled access, carefully staged events, and limited interaction with journalists. The new approach would require completely different skills and institutional structures to support genuine dialogue with the British people. The foreign diplomatic corps in London faced the delicate task of explaining to their governments whether Britain's constitutional stability remained reliable given the dramatic changes in how the monarchy understood its role and responsibilities. International agreements, trade relationships, and security arrangements had been negotiated with the assumption that British constitutional frameworks would continue operating according to established precedents. The Crown's voluntary submission to democratic accountability created uncertainty about the continuity of commitments that previous governments had made. The Commonwealth realms found themselves confronting the possibility that their shared monarch might no longer function according to the constitutional principles that had justified maintaining the Crown as head of state despite achieving political independence. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had preserved constitutional monarchy partly because of its perceived stability and predictability. William and Catherine's embrace of democratic accountability could trigger Republican movements that had previously lacked compelling arguments for constitutional change. The most complex constitutional questions involved the relationship between royal transparency and the fundamental principles that had historically justified hereditary authority within democratic systems. The constitutional monarchy had survived in modern democracies by maintaining careful separation between royal ceremonial functions and political decision-making processes. William and Catherine's commitment to public accountability appeared to eliminate this separation in ways that could either strengthen or undermine the monarchy's constitutional legitimacy. Catherine discovered that implementing their vision of transparent royal service would require cooperation from institutions that had not been consulted about their plans and might not support the changes they were proposing. Royal finances involved multiple government departments, Security arrangements required coordination with intelligence agencies, and diplomatic functions affected foreign policy objectives that extended far beyond constitutional concerns. Their personal commitment to accountability could only be fulfilled through systematic institutional reform. The afternoon also brought the first serious assessment of public reaction to the morning's events, and the results surprised both supporters and critics of the royal family. Opinion polling conducted within hours of the balcony appearance showed overwhelming approval for William and Catherine's approach, with particular support for their commitment to financial transparency and democratic accountability. The British people appeared to have been waiting for exactly the kind of royal leadership that constitutional experts found most concerning. Religious leaders faced their own complex questions about the implications of William's eventual coronation as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The traditional coronation ceremony included religious elements that emphasized divine authority and hereditary right, concepts that seemed incompatible with the democratic principles William and Catherine had embraced. Church officials began discussing whether coronation rituals would need to be fundamentally revised, or whether William might choose to forego traditional religious consecration entirely. Security agencies tasked with protecting the royal family found themselves evaluating threat assessments that had been calculated based on traditional royal protocols and public relationships. William and Catherine's commitment to increased public accessibility could create security vulnerabilities that existing protection arrangements were not designed to address. The balance between democratic engagement and personal safety would require completely new approaches to royal security planning. The evening brought private conversations between William and Catherine that revealed the personal costs of the revolutionary path they had chosen. Both understood that their marriage, their children's lives, and their own futures had been irrevocably altered by their public commitments to transparency and accountability. There would be no possibility of retreat to traditional royal privacy, no opportunity to reconsider their promises without destroying their credibility entirely. Catherine reflected on the transformation of her role from traditional royal consort to equal partner in constitutional innovation. 3. She had originally anticipated a gradual evolution into royal responsibilities over many years, with careful preparation and extensive support from experienced palace staff. Instead, she found herself helping to design completely new approaches to royal service while simultaneously implementing them under intense public scrutiny. The international implications of their approach became clearer as diplomatic communications arrived from around the world seeking clarification about Britain's constitutional stability and the continuity of royal authority. William and Catherine realized that their personal decisions about transparent royal service had created global consequences that extended far beyond their original intentions to modernize the British monarchy. Parliamentary leaders requested urgent meetings to discuss the constitutional implications of royal commitments that appeared to merge crown authority with democratic processes in unprecedented ways. The traditional separation between royal ceremonial functions and political decision-making had been fundamental to British constitutional development for centuries. William and Catherine's embrace of public accountability challenged these distinctions in ways that could require comprehensive constitutional reform. The final briefing of the day involved security assessments that highlighted the practical challenges of implementing democratic royal engagement while maintaining the safety and effectiveness of constitutional monarchy. Every aspect of royal service, from charitable patronages and public appearances to diplomatic representation and ceremonial duties, would need to be reconsidered in light of their commitments to transparency and accountability. As they prepared for sleep, on what would later be recognized as one of the most significant days in modern British constitutional history, William and Catherine both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Their vision of democratic royal service would either modernize constitutional monarchy for the 21st century or contribute to its peaceful evolution into whatever system the British people eventually preferred. Either outcome would represent a fundamental transformation of institutions that had shaped British society for 1,000 years. 6 months after their revolutionary balcony appearance, William and Catherine had transformed not only their own approach to royal service, but the entire relationship between the Crown and British society. The changes they initiated during those first crucial hours had evolved into systematic institutional reforms that touched every aspect of constitutional monarchy. Their experiment in democratic royal accountability had either succeeded beyond anyone's expectations or created problems so complex that their full implications remained unclear. The most visible transformation involved royal finances, an area that had been shrouded in secrecy for generations despite nominal parliamentary oversight. Catherine had personally overseen the development of quarterly financial reports that detailed every aspect of crown expenditure, from security costs and staff salaries to charitable donations and household expenses. And the level of transparency exceeded what most government departments provided, establishing precedents that other public institutions found themselves pressured to match. The quarterly financial disclosures revealed spending patterns and decision-making processes that surprised both critics and supporters of the monarchy. Royal expenditures appeared more modest than many had assumed, with significant portions directed toward charitable initiatives and public service activities that had received little previous attention. However, the reports also highlighted costs associated with maintaining royal properties and ceremonial functions that prompted serious public debate about priorities and alternatives. William's commitment to subjecting royal decisions to public consultation had created entirely new mechanisms for democratic participation in constitutional monarchy. The palace had established online platforms where British citizens could review proposed royal initiatives, submit questions about crown policies, and participate in discussions about the monarchy's role in addressing social issues. The response had been overwhelming, with millions of participants engaging in conversations about royal service that would have been impossible under traditional protocols. The success of these democratic engagement initiatives had attracted international attention from constitutional scholars, political leaders, and citizens of other constitutional monarchies who were curious about whether similar reforms might be possible in their own countries. Delegations from European royal families, Commonwealth governments, and academic institutions had visited London to study the practical implementation of transparent royal governance and assess its implications for constitutional monarchy worldwide. Catherine's role had evolved from traditional royal consort to something approaching an elected official who happened to hold hereditary office. She maintained regular office hours for meetings with citizens, advocacy groups, and policy experts who sought royal support for various initiatives. Her calendar, published monthly in advance, included detailed explanations of her priorities and decision-making criteria for selecting engagements and charitable patronages. The transformation in royal parliamentary relations represented perhaps the most significant constitutional development. William had established regular briefing sessions with parliamentary leaders from all parties, providing detailed reports on royal activities and seeking guidance about the Crown's role in supporting democratic governance. These sessions had evolved into genuine policy consultations that influenced both royal priorities and parliamentary considerations of constitutional reform. The children's education had been completely reconceptualized to prepare them for roles in a democratically accountable monarchy rather than a traditional hereditary institution. Instead of learning primarily about royal protocol and constitutional tradition, they studied democratic theory, public administration, and the practical challenges of serving institutions that derived their legitimacy from public consent rather than hereditary right. International diplomatic relationships had required careful adjustment as foreign governments adapted to dealing with a crown that operated according to transparent decision-making processes and public accountability mechanisms. Additional diplomatic protocols had assumed royal discretion and confidential consultation, approaches that were incompatible with William and Catherine's commitment to democratic engagement and public disclosure. The most unexpected consequence of their reforms involved the emergence of similar transparency initiatives throughout the British government and other public institutions. Parliament had adopted quarterly public consultation sessions modeled on royal democratic engagement platforms. Government departments had increased financial disclosure and public participation in policy development. Local governments had implemented citizen advisory mechanisms inspired by royal innovation and democratic accountability. Public opinion polling consistently showed strong support for the reformed monarchy, with particularly high approval ratings for financial transparency and democratic participation mechanisms. The polling also revealed growing expectations for continued reform and expansion of democratic accountability that extended far beyond what William and Catherine had originally envisioned. Their success had created public demand for even more fundamental changes in how constitutional monarchy operated. Constitutional scholars remained divided about the long-term implications of royal democratic accountability. Supporters argued that William and Catherine had demonstrated monarchy's compatibility with 21st-century democratic values, ensuring its continued relevance and legitimacy. Critics worried that the precedents they had established would inevitably lead to the dissolution of constitutional monarchy as democratic principles overwhelmed hereditary authority. The Commonwealth realms had responded to British royal reforms with varying degrees of enthusiasm and concern. Some countries had initiated their own constitutional discussions about implementing similar transparency and accountability mechanisms. Others had begun seriously considering Republican alternatives for the first time in decades. The shared crown that had historically united Commonwealth nations now highlighted their different approaches to balancing tradition with democratic innovation. Religious institutions faced ongoing questions about the compatibility of divine authority concepts with democratic accountability principles. The Church of England had begun extensive theological discussions about coronation ceremonies, religious authority, and the relationship between spiritual and political leadership in a democratically accountable monarchy. These discussions influenced broader conversations about religion's role in constitutional governance. Security arrangements had adapted to accommodate increased public accessibility while maintaining protection for royal family members who now engaged with citizens in ways their predecessors would have found impossible. New protocols balanced democratic engagement with safety requirements, creating models that other public officials had begun adopting for their own interactions with constituents. The personal cost of their revolutionary approach had become apparent as William and Catherine adjusted to lives that offered unprecedented public service opportunities but virtually no privacy or protection from democratic scrutiny. Their marriage, their parenting decisions, and their personal values had become subjects of public discussion in ways that traditional royal families had never experienced. Media relationships had evolved from carefully managed interactions with accredited royal correspondents to ongoing dialogue with journalists, bloggers, and citizens who participated in the palace's democratic engagement platforms. Traditional royal media management had been replaced by comprehensive communication strategies designed to support transparent governance rather than protect royal privacy. And royal reforms had extended throughout British society as increased transparency and democratic accountability created new standards for institutional governance. The businesses, charitable organizations, and government agencies found themselves adopting similar approaches to public engagement and financial disclosure, creating economy-wide trends toward greater accountability. Educational institutions had begun developing new curricula that reflected the transformed relationship between hereditary institutions and democratic governance. Constitutional law courses, political science programs, and public administration studies had incorporated analysis of royal democratic accountability as a case study in institutional innovation and constitutional adaptation. As William and Catherine reflected on the first 6 months of their experiment in democratic royal service, they recognized that they had initiated changes that extended far beyond their original intentions to modernize the monarchy. Their personal commitment to transparency and accountability had contributed to broader transformations in British democratic culture that would influence constitutional development for generations to come. Silence that had greeted their first appearance as democratically accountable monarchs had been replaced by ongoing conversation between the Crown and the British people about the proper role of hereditary institutions in democratic society. Whether this conversation would ultimately strengthen constitutional monarchy or facilitate its peaceful evolution into republican governance remained an open question that William and Catherine had committed themselves to answering through continued service and respect for whatever constitutional arrangements the British people eventually chose to embrace.